I'm Anna,
I'm Jessica.
and this is the Paranoia Pair.
Man, it's been a week. We got a snowstorm. We had a state of emergency, apparently. We were under a travel ban for like 2 days. Literally, I couldn't leave the house for almost a week. I was going insane. I got really into watching unboxing videos. What else has happened? Hmm. Jessica had a bird that was stuck on her porch. Literally everyone in town bought out Walmart's entire supply of bread and milk, but not the 1% milk. No one fucks with the 1% milk and the fat free. Nobody. Not even in an emergency. What else? I think this is about it. Anyway, I'm going to segue into another snowstorm that happened January 26th, 2011, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The community was expecting a huge snowstorm. Schools were sending kids home early in order to prepare for the upcoming storm, and Ellen Greenberg, a teacher at a local school, made her way back to her apartment she shared with her fiancé, Sam Goldberg. Sam comes home from the gym at around 5:30 p.m. that day, but he can't get the door open. He goes down to the front desk and told the concierge that Ellen had come home early, but he was locked out of the apartment. The concierge told him that he's not allowed to leave the front desk, so he tried to get a hold of maintenance to help, and he told Sam to keep trying to get a hold of Ellen in the meantime. So Sam goes back upstairs to their apartment, and he continues knocking on the door and trying to kind of talk to Ellen through the door to get her to unlock it. It had a latch lock that you see a lot of the time in hotel rooms, and it can only be locked and unlocked from the inside of the apartment. So this isn't like a, oh, he forgot his keys kind of thing. It doesn't work though. So Sam goes back to the front desk and tells the concierge that he needs to get into the concierge asks if he thinks that something's wrong, and Sam says he's not sure, but he's just gonna knock the door down. And that is exactly what he does. He continued to knock. He texted Ellen multiple times and still nothing, so Sam did knock the door down. When he knocks the door down, he sees Ellen on the floor with blood all over the place. He calls 911 and he told the operator that Ellen was not responding. So the operator kind of instructs Sam to rip her shirt off in order to perform CPR. And after Sam unzips her shirt, he sees the stab wounds and the knife sticking out of Ellen's chest. Sam tells 911 that Ellen had stabbed herself or fell down on a knife. At approximately 6:40 p.m., firefighters, police, and detectives show up to the scene. They find Ellen slumped against a corner cabinet. Ellen is pronounced dead, and she had been stabbed 20 times. Police find medication prescribed to Ellen in the apartment, and after talking to Sam, they rule her death a suicide. And Ellen had really been struggling with her mental health. Her family and her friends close to her did notice a difference. She wasn't happy at her job. She was super stressed and she had a ton of anxiety. She was seeing a psychiatrist and was prescribed medication, and to everyone around her, it seemed to be working. Friends that worked with Ellen noted that the night Ellen was found dead, she had been obsessing over the report cards. They were coming out soon, and she was really worried about the kids' grades, but she never expressed any suicidal thoughts. She never talked about wanting to die, and that didn't really sound like somebody who was planning on ending their life that night. Ellen's body and the apartment weren't really recorded very well by police. There were very few photos taken of Ellen's body at the apartment, and her body was not even examined thoroughly until the autopsy. In fact, they didn't even know about half of Ellen's stab wounds until the autopsy was done. Ellen had multiple stab wounds on the back of her neck, and she had a huge wound in the back of her head from a knife. Since her death was ruled a suicide, they didn't hold the crime scene, Management had the apartment cleaned by a company recommended by the police department. So Sam's uncle was able to stop by the apartment the next day to grab personal items. Management did videotape the apartment before, so if something came up missing, she would have evidence on what was inside. And Sam's uncle takes the electronics with him, including Ellen's laptop and devices. And Sam's uncle is a prominent attorney in Philadelphia. 2 days later is when Ellen's funeral takes place. Her family's Jewish, and according to religious tradition, burial typically happens as soon as possible. The atmosphere at the funeral is pretty tense. There's a clear divide in the room. Some who believe that Ellen had taken her own life, and others, including many of her friends and family members, who refuse to accept that Ellen would have done this with everything they know about her. The morning of the funeral, Ellen's family learns something pretty shocking. The medical examiner, Dr. Marlon Osborne, has ruled Ellen's death a homicide, but they don't hear about this directly from the police. They learn about it by watching the news. After the homicide ruling becomes public, police return to Ellen and Sam's apartment, but by this point, the apartment has already been cleaned professionally, and key items have already been removed. And it doesn't really help that the police appear to be reluctant about pursuing this case. The interviews are very brief. They ask maybe a total of 6 questions. They don't really follow up with anybody. And when asked by a reporter where the investigation stands, the police say that they're treating the death as suspicious, but they're still leaning towards suicide. Then, on March 10th, 2011, the medical examiner's office reverses again. Ellen's death is officially ruled a suicide again, and the case is closed. Two friends of Ellen's parents, Josh and Sandy, met with a friend. One was a retired judge, and one was a dentist. And the friend they were meeting was Thomas, who was a retired state trooper. They start telling him about this case. So they give Thomas the documentation they have, which is the autopsy report, autopsy photographs, and a few crime scene photographs. And Thomas comes to the conclusion on his own that it was a murder. Thomas agrees to look into Ellen's death for Ellen's parents for free. In the crime scene photos, Ellen had dried blood on her face that was running from her nose to her ear. But when she was found, she was sitting up leaning against the cabinets, and the blood should be running down her face, not across it. In the autopsy report, there was a lot of bruising reported in different stages of healing, which weren't really seen as being connected to her murder. Ellen had started seeing a psychiatrist in January 2011, and she was prescribed 2 medications. Klonopin, which was an anti-anxiety drug, also Ambien, which is a sleep aid. And when interviewed, the original investigators did question whether or not those medications could have contributed to the bruising on Ellen's body. And there's also a possibility that Ellen was also doing intense workouts. But we do know that Ellen had 3 appointments with a psychiatrist to talk about anxiety, but she never said anything bad about Sam. In fact, her psychiatrist said that whenever Ellen mentioned Sam, she always seemed happy and smiled. There were suicide Google search discrepancies between the reports in Ellen's files and findings from the DA's office, but remember, these devices were picked up from the apartment the day after Ellen was found dead. Thomas thought it would be best to get in touch with a reporter and to give them all the documentation he had in order to kind of help Ellen's case get more publicity. Ellen's parents agreed to do an interview, and the reporter felt like Ellen's parents had completely legitimate and valid questions that were not being answered by the police department. And in 2018, the article was publicized. The reporter did a really good job on this, and it kind of really shocked everybody how much information was in this article. So the day Ellen died, she had stopped at 126 to get gas and make a phone call. There's nothing really alarming about this, but it was the last confirmed activity before she got to her apartment. At 4:46, the last known activity occurs on Ellen's computer. 4 minutes later, at 4:50 p.m., surveillance footage shows Sam leaving the apartment to go to the gym inside their building. So at this point, Ellen was believed to be alive in the apartment. Sam spent about 40 minutes at the gym, and at 5:30 p.m., surveillance footage shows Sam returning to the apartment floor by using the elevator. And he tried to enter the apartment, and he can't. The 20 stab wounds that Ellen suffered from included stab wounds to her chest, stab wounds to her abdomen, multiple stab wounds to her neck, and a stab wound on the back of her head. The wound on the back of her head had actually penetrated her brain. These were inflicted with significant force. And yet, police concluded that Ellen had inflicted all of these herself. How does someone stab themselves repeatedly that many times, including the back of the neck and the head? I don't understand. So now we're going to get to the search history. There were reports conflicting about when these searches occurred and on which device. And what complicates this even further is the fact that these devices were removed from the apartment the day after her death. So, chain of custody is a serious concern here because who accessed these devices when? None of these questions are ever answered, but there is a way for someone to manipulate the search history and make it look like someone did search something on a certain day and a certain time. The search history included terms like suicide methods, quick suicide, and painless suicide. There were other searches on Ellen's devices that included things related to her medication she was on, like weight gain and sleepiness, but there were no other searches involving suicide. So, again, all of these details in the report really reignited the public interest in this case. Everyone was in agreement that Ellen did not take her own life. This story caught the attention of an attorney named Joe Pedraza, and he agreed to take on Ellen's case. He actually filed a lawsuit seeking to have her death reclassified as a homicide or undetermined. And the family would actually get access to surveillance footage from the apartment complex. And when Joe Pedraza first requests the footage, police insist it doesn't exist. But of course, after legal pressure, the footage suddenly appears. The video reveals discrepancies between official reports and what had actually happened. For example, reports claimed Sam was escorted back to the apartment, but the footage does not support that because, again, remember, the concierge was not allowed to leave the front desk. Another detail also emerges. The building manager confirms that the swing bar latches that were on the apartment building doors can actually sometimes engage accidentally if the door is slammed hard enough, and it had actually happened to her personally. So this raises the possibility that the latch was not intentionally secured by Ellen inside of the apartment. During depositions, it's also revealed that there was a meeting between the Philadelphia Police Department, a member of the DA's office, and Dr. Osborne. And during that meeting, Dr. Osborne had heard enough information that he was convinced to change Ellen's death from a homicide to suicide. And of course, nobody took notes of this very important meeting, and there were no real answers given about what information was shared in this meeting and who had shared it. Also, during the deposition, they talked with a neuropathologist, and she had reviewed Ellen's autopsy and determined that the spinal cord injury Ellen had did not have hemorrhaging. So this either means that the stab wound happened after she was already dead, or the wound didn't go into the tissue very far, and the effects of the wound did not occur or affect her by the time she had died. The family also filed a second lawsuit against the Philadelphia Police Department for conspiracy, but they reached a settlement with Dr. Marlon Osborne that states he would publicly state that he thinks Ellen's death should not be considered a suicide. The day before jury selection, the Philadelphia Police Department actually reaches a settlement that they will reopen the investigation to Ellen's death, but nothing else has really been done. The district attorney and the police department doubled down on the suicide verdict. As part of the settlement, the Greenberg family received financial compensation, but I think more importantly, it kind of allowed them to continue pursuing legal action without the case being dismissed. But to Ellen's parents, this wasn't about money. This is all about accountability and fighting for justice for their only daughter. They weren't asking courts to name the killer. They were just asking the system to admit that something went wrong and that Ellen's death was not handled the way it should have been. And on October 10th, 2025, the medical examiner Lindsay Simon ruled Ellen's death a suicide, but she did acknowledge the unusual state of Ellen's injuries. That's kind of where the case stands right now. Ellen's death remains officially a suicide. When you look at the full timeline, it becomes harder to believe anything in this case was handled correctly. There's a suicide ruling made within hours. We have a crime scene that was cleaned up because it wasn't secured. We have electronics that was removed before forensic analysis was done. We have surveillance footage that supposedly didn't exist until there was threat of legal action. None of these things on their own really prove what happened to Ellen, but together it really does prove that these people were more focused on closing a case than finding out what really happened to Ellen. It's been more than 10 years, and Ellen's family is still fighting for justice. And Sam has moved on. He really truly believes that Ellen really took her own life. And I just don't understand how someone can stab themselves 20 times.
Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook at Paranoia Pair Pod. And we will see you next Friday.
Stay spooky.